Welcome, everybody. Welcome to ODI and virtually to the World Bank in Washington, D.C., to the seventh meeting of our meeting series on fragile states. This is a very special meeting because I think for the first time ever at ODI, we are experimenting with more sort of a virtual connection and connecting with the speakers from far away. And I just thought I'd share with you a few facts about what the implications of this choice of trying to use a video link rather than flying Sarah and Chuck over to London mean. Effectively, by not flying Sarah and Chuck over to London, we are saving roughly almost 2 tons of CO2 emissions. And I found out this morning that's the equivalent of 4.2 barrels of oil consumed, and perhaps more interestingly, of 75.6 propane cylinders used for home barbecues. So that means that next summer we can all have our barbecues with a clean conscience, and in London that will all depend on the weather, of course, but that's somewhat related to the climate change issues. Anyway, welcome everybody. Welcome in particular Chuck and Sarah, who I'm going to introduce in a minute, from London, and to Alina, our discussant here at ODI. I'm Marta Foresti. I'm the program leader of the Politics and Governance program at ODI, and together with my colleague Sara Pantuliano, I've been responsible for coordinating this meeting series on fragile states, which is coming to an end. This is effectively the last of our thematic meetings. We're going to have a closing meeting on the 2nd of December that will officially conclude the series. I think it's very timely that this last thematic meeting is on state building in fragile states. We have covered a number of issues in this series, and interestingly, the issue of state building came up from the very early stages of the series. At the very first meeting back in July, James Putzel argued that elite bargains or political settlements are what ultimately determine the trajectory of fragility and resilience, and that when it comes to the international community engaging in fragile states, development agencies need to understand that they can only know a state by knowing its political settlement, and this requires understanding the bargains that are at the heart of political power. So the issue of political settlement in relation to state building came up from the very beginning, and at the same meeting, Sara Pantuliano from ODI, which has a long experience of working in conflict-affected countries, in Sudan in particular, reminded us that achieving a more inclusive political settlement is the challenge ahead, and that often the focus on the state can take away an emphasis on, for example, the civil society and other actors which in post-conflict countries in particular play a particularly important role. And a more inclusive political settlement means bargains that go, or negotiations that go beyond the elite to include other actors too. Again, the issue of the importance of political settlements and how that relates to institutions building came up in the meeting on peace agreements only a couple of weeks ago, where Nicholas Heidsum reminded us that when it comes, for example, to elections in conflict-affected states, whilst some commentators argue that often they do not necessarily help peace processes and can be destabilizing, perhaps the issues we should focus on is what kind of election contestation we're looking for, and particularly focus on the price of the election processes rather than necessarily the process itself. And Alex de Waal sort of took this argument around democracy support in fragile states further by reminding us is that if the settlement that matters within some of these conflict states is within existing patronage-based systems and political marketplaces, then the international community needs to start to take those interpretation of democracy more seriously and take that into consideration in state building, in its state building effort. That meeting, I think one line I take away from Kieran Prendergast reminded us all that it's imperative that one needs to do what's realistic and achievable, that often in those situations it's not possible to solve problems, but only minimize them. And I'm curious to hear whether when we think about the international community's engagement in support of state building in fragile states, that's an important reminder for us all. The meeting series covered a number of other issues. I've only touched on a couple that I think are useful to start off, to kick off this particular meeting. We also covered issues of justice and transitional justice and rule of law. We looked at early recovery experiences with particular emphasis on Sudan, among many other topics. And I'm very grateful to you all who have been participating actively in the series from the beginning. A special welcome also to our online audiences that today join in this experiment of virtual communications. And they will also have a role to play later on when we animate a discussion based on the interventions that Sarah, Chuck, and Alina will propose. Let me introduce the panel for our meeting today, because I think we have a very special combination of expertise among the table, or at least virtually so. Charles Cole is Assistant Professor of International Relations and of Peace and Conflict Resolution at American University, and last academic year was Senior Fellow at the US Institute for Peace. He published a book in 2008, which has been very influential for all of us who work on state building in conflict and post-conflict countries, called, Building States to Build Peace. And his work has, over the years, have focused on post-conflict, not conflict, post-conflict, peace building, state building, democratization, human rights, and also policing and justice reform, which again are issues that came up strongly during the series, some of the challenges ahead for the international community. His earlier work focused mostly on Latin and Central America, but also over the years worked in Haiti, Afghanistan, West Africa, Bosnia, Kosovo, and South Africa. Sarah Cliff from the World Bank has worked for the last 20 years in countries emerging from conflict and in political transition, from Afghanistan, Burundi, Central African Republic, DRC, Guinea-Bissau, Ethiopia, Haiti, Indonesia, Liberia, Rwanda, Sudan, South Africa, and Timor-Leste. So we have here a very extensive experience of many different contexts and countries. Prior to joining the bank, Sarah worked for the United Nations Development Programme in Rwanda and for the government of South Africa. And since joining the bank, she has covered post-conflict reconstruction, community-driven development, and civil service reform. She was the Director of Operations for East Africa and the Pacific from 2007 till 2009. And currently, she's the Special Representative and Director for the World Development Report on Conflict, Security and Development, which will be the WDR in 2011, right? Yes. The last speaker on our panel and the discussant in today's meeting is my colleague Alina Roca-Menocal, who also works in the Politics and Governance Program at ODI. Alina's original academic interests were specifically on democratization and decentralization process in comparative perspective, and specifically in Latin America. Since joining ODI, Alina has worked on the developmental states and indeed coordinated a very special meeting series on the developmental states a couple of years ago. And in the last couple of years, there's particularly focused on her work on institution and state building, with a special focus on the fragile states and post-conflict environment. So I will ask Chuck to make his presentation first. Both Chuck and Sarah will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes each. Alina will then have about 10 minutes to respond and propose some additional comments, and then we'll open the discussion to all of you for comments and questions. Chuck, please.
Thank you. Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very good. The only problem that we've seen in this arrangement so far is that the lights here, because of their environmental sensitivity, seem to be cutting on and off because we're not moving enough. So you will either get a disco effect of lights going on and off, or us waving our hands to try to keep them on. So just so you're aware of that. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning, and thank you for the invitation. I just want to start by saying, by citing some of the reasons why peace building and state building are important. I think if for people who care about justice, human rights, peacemaking, peacekeeping, and of course development, all of those challenges are intimately tied to post-conflict and fragile states at this moment in history. I think arguably the most exciting and difficult challenge in these disparate fields is to facilitate a process of building legitimate and self-sustaining institutions in other societies, institutions that can provide security, and peace sustainably, that can protect rights, deliver justice, and to deliver other basic services, and create the framework for equitable growth and human development. And I think we've seen some very positive developments in the last several years in this field. Among those are the creation of institutions within bilateral donor countries, as well as in the UN system, as well as in the AU and other and the OAS, to try to join up government and whole of government approaches. Most of your audience, I'm sure, are quite well aware of those innovations. At the same time, I think there's some well-deserved criticisms for the persistent shortcomings in this field. We've seen some spectacular reversions to armed conflict once peace was seemingly realized. And I think folks who are in these societies also have grown and expressed frustration with the shortcomings of international actors and their ability to make a difference on the ground. We were asked, Martha asked if I would address some of the factors that seem to determine success and failure. I think this is very difficult. I think we've seen some of the research has shown that we can identify some risk factors for the failure of war. It's even more difficult, in my mind, to identify the risk factors for fragile states and what are the causes that lead to state fragility. And one of the reasons for that is because state fragility is such an all-encompassing term that it catches different things that have different causal mechanisms, some of which contradict one another. So you have legitimacy problems in certain states that are considered fragile, you have security problems in others, and you have institutional capacity problems in others. And the dynamics around each of those challenges is somewhat different, and the actions that strengthen one might undermine the other. And therefore, it's really quite complicated to make overarching generalizations about state fragility, in my mind. I hope that Sarah might, have some observations on that front from the work of in preparation for the report. But one of the things that I like to remind people of when we look at this quantitative work by colleagues such as Paul Collier, Fioran and Leighton and others, is that the degree of impact of these salient variables is not necessarily very big. So, for example, Fioran and Leighton, really one of their big findings is that state capacity is important, but their proxy for state capacity is dependence on export commodities. And the only indicator that they use in their work for that is dependence on oil. But what they find is that the chances of experiencing civil war go up only 1% if a state's imports are over 33%. So it's a bilateral variable, and if you have it, then the chances of experiencing civil war is only 1% greater. So these are risk factors that are there and that are important, but the statistical significance doesn't necessarily translate into operational significance, if you will. And as a result of that, qualitative studies are one of the things that we need more of to draw some robust conclusions about what we know about both post-conflict countries and fragile states, which are related but not necessarily the same thing. This is part of the logic of the book that you mentioned earlier, Building States to Build Peace, that I edited and that Sarah contributed to as well, a very good chapter that was a project of the International Peace Institute. And we don't identify factors of success and failure here, but there are two crucial areas based on this research that I've done particularly recently that examine dozens of cases of war recurrence that I just wanted to call attention to. One of them is security. I won't spend a lot of time on this because it's widespread sort of recognition that security is important. Security doesn't necessarily mean international troops on the ground, because we have cases where basically national actors were able to make agreements about security and where political will exists, if you will, and then international troops can be incidental. So we saw that in Central America and some of the Southern African cases in the early 1990s. But where that security is contested, then providing security is vital. Is really it's a necessary condition, but not sufficient for any outcome. It provides the space for political processes, and that brings me to the second point, which is really state legitimacy. Now, by state legitimacy, this is a complicated thing, and it's easy to sort of throw the term out and very difficult to measure and know what we're talking about. It's easier to talk about what it's not. And so legitimacy is not necessarily, and is not elections or democracy, and it's certainly not only democracy and elections. At the same time, in our contemporary normative environment globally, legitimate elections are necessary for state legitimacy. Even in societies that that don't have a history of that, opposition forces basically make recourse to the practice, to the international standards about elections that play into national level politics in ways that are unavoidable. But the problem is that elected governments don't necessarily solve problems, and in some cases they can aggravate them. And so 2 of the 3 cases, for example, of post-war state-building efforts that failed sufficiently that we had to redeploy international peacekeeping troops, were Haiti and Liberia. The 3rd case was East Timor. But in those cases, in Haiti and Liberia, the problem, and I'm talking here about the problems that led to the reintroduction of troops in 1999 in Liberia after Charles Taylor's election, and the reintroduction of troops in Haiti after President Aristide's re-election in 2000. The problem in the problems of war reversion in these cases was not development problems directly, although these might have been risk factors, but it was really the conduct. We're getting some strange noises over here. I don't know if you hear them.
On the roads, unfortunately.
So
there's not much we can do about some road works. Sorry.
Okay. But the principal reason is that these elected presidents acted in ways that were quite exclusionary. And there was limited action that the international community could take about that. I'll come back to that. But they acted in ways that deepened legitimacy crisis. Economic factors were important here, but really, I want to go back and reinforce the points that you raised, Marta, at the beginning and introducing the session, which is really the processes of political bargain and agreement amongst elites, I believe, are a crucial factor, and that development actors, security actors, need to basically marry their programs and resources and strategies toward political settlements at this level. And by political settlements, I don't mean peace agreements, okay? I mean essentially what are often tacit or implicit bargains amongst elites about the basic rules of the game politically, right? And so those are sort of referred to as pacts in the democratization literature. Those pacts are not necessarily explicit. And so if you have an agreement on the rules of the game and a willingness to abide by those, I think that's one of the most crucial things that you can find has a factor in success here. Having said that, let me move on, and I want to make some comments about 4 different issues for the remainder of this, okay? The first one is effectiveness, okay? And I think that one of the factors that one of the issues of effectiveness is resources, and this is a crucial element, and as Sir Kieran, my former boss at DPA, was fond of saying, is that there's a lot of what we talk about is within the realm of what we can do within political will. We need political will and we need resources, and we're sort of tinkering around the margins without the resources and will that we need amongst the international community. And so much of what we do in this business is often because the international community is not willing to devote sufficient resources necessary for success. And I can give some examples of that, but I presume that you're familiar with some of those. But resources and development alone are not the solution either, or not the only factor that's relevant here. In Haiti, when I was, there was a Canadian development officer who told a UN peacekeeping official, we've been here 20 years and we're going to be here long after you. She said this is in the context of resentment at the presence of these security actors, and she said it as a way of pride. And unfortunately, this is really should be seen as an acknowledgement of the limits of developments in a weakly institutionalized society like Haiti. And so it's really,
sorry.
It's very, sorry, it's distracting, yeah. So it's really, this is a problem in the development community, that these attitudes prevail, that this is an endless enterprise and a reluctance to engage with security and conflict issues. And I think at the operational level, this is something that bilaterals and multilaterals continue to need to work on based on my conversations with some of those folks. One of the things that I think is really important here is much more cross-trained and cross-career staff tracks. We need incentives for people not to stay in development ministries for their entire careers, but to also cross over to development, to foreign ministries, to work in security. We need staff that basically have experience on the ground in humanitarian and security and diplomatic and development jobs, in order to fully appreciate the challenges that are there and the institutional mechanisms for working in these areas. We also have a serious issue of architecture, which is that no one's in charge, so everyone's in charge, and no one's accountable, and what little capacities do exist are widely dispersed across multilateral and bilateral actors. So, for example, Jeffrey Sachs just recently called for creating a new institution focused on early development. Again, that's a positive thing, but it's only part of the solution, only one part, and it's only focused on the development piece. So, let me move on. I feel like time is short, and so I'm going to skip over a couple things I was going to say. One of the things that I'm concerned about also is the creation of capacities, of international capacities that we've seen, which is one of the more recent innovations that responds to a very genuine need, and that is the need for greater international civilian capacity in post-conflict and fragile states in operations in these areas. So one of the problems, at the same time, I'm concerned that what we see is creating a supply that artificially seeks demand and doesn't respond to a demand that's really there. One of the problems with this is that we already have some multilateral capacity, and this bilateral capacity is being created without regard for the multilateral capacity that already exists. And so I think we need more sensitivity to that. I'll come back to this point in a minute. So on this point on coherence and coordination and effectiveness, I think we need to reduce duplication of efforts, but we also need to enhance coordination. We still need to strengthen integration of integrated missions within the UN. We have problems within the UN family and within government interagency processes that still, of coordination and coherence. Just, I personally was disappointed at the depth of the recommendations in the SG's report on peace building in the immediate aftermath of conflict, that those did not go farther towards trying to resolve some of these problems. But we find these also in bilaterals, so that you have ministries of finance that do things, that make policies regarding a particular state that the foreign ministry is at odds with, that is at odds with what the development ministry is arguing for. And they show, the whole of government approach is not going to be solved by creating a single entity like a stabilization unit or SCRS here in the United States, but really that whole of government mentality needs to percolate up to the full country strategy across all the ministries and at the highest levels. The second issue that I want to talk about is national ownership. And I think, we make all kinds of lip service to national ownership, and it's a nice thing that everyone says. And we certainly have seen progress in this area in planning and implementation on the ground in fragile states. We have, come a long way in the last 10 years in terms of getting, first of all, the UN system, the World Bank and the IFIs on the one hand, with the UN agencies on the other, and the diplomatic and peacekeeping departments working in closer coordination in developing transitional plans and in poverty reductions and PRSPs. We also, and bilaterals are part of that as well. At the same time, I mean, when I was in Haiti last year doing some research, which is held up as one of the better examples recently of this processes, there still continues to be an element of ventriloquism here, where international actors are holding up, the puppets of national strategies and national processes, which don't actually reflect the voices and participation of either elites or much less broader civil society. So that even if you have meetings around the country, which they did in Haiti in preparing the PRSP consultations, most of civil society felt like their concerns did not reach and did not make it sufficiently into the planning documents. And the second point, second point on national ownership I want to make, which really goes, think again of Haiti and Liberia examples that I gave earlier, is that the development, there still continues to be a gap between the sort of upfront push of the defense and diplomacy agencies on the one hand, and the longer-term perspectives of development agency on the other, without filling that sort of short and medium-term gap that we need. And one of the places we see this is in the issue of leverage in fostering legitimacy. So that once an election is held, I think then there's a logic that the political leverage is much reduced, and that now we're in a development mode, and it's excessively unconditional support for an elected government. And there's some good reasons for this. But at the same time, I feel like the problems that we see come often because of this particular problem. So that we need to try to build ongoing mechanisms to keep opposition parties and insurgent forces part of a process even after elections are held in order to avoid electoral authoritarianism. The third issue I want to talk about is sustainability. This is in contrast to peacemaking and peacekeeping. Sustainability has been a concern of the peace-building industry and the fragile states work from the get-go. Indeed, the emphasis on state building itself has become, it basically reflects and signals a greater commitment to sustainable outcomes by a commitment to developing adequate institutions such that international organizations don't have to carry out certain functions. But I think that we have a long way to go on this front. The defense and development gap that I just mentioned is one element of that. And then I'm going to go back to this creation of, for example, the Civilian Response Corps in this country that we've created. You might not be aware of it, so one sentence on that for if you're not, which is this basically is the U.S. government's attempt to try to create civilian capacity for stabilization and what they call reconstruction and stabilization operations, RNS, if you're not familiar with the acronym. And it's basically they've authorized the creation of up to 4,000 civilians, some of which will be permanent, active, some of which will be standby, and some of which will be reserve to deploy, largely in response to the Pentagon's dissatisfaction with civilian capacity when after the Iraq war was launched in 2003. So now we have a group of of American citizens who have technical capacities that are abilities to deploy. We already have 400 of these, and more are being hired with specializations in areas like law enforcement. Half of them are in rule of law, so we have drug specializations, prison corrections officer specialists who are basically on call. The orientation of these bodies, though, are still not acknowledging the need to basically make facilitating and supporting national capacities and local actors at the center of the work. And so the hiring criteria and the operational approach of these actors is not sufficiently toward essentially a more development mentality of supporting. And so the first port of call for civilian capacity should always be at the national and local level. The second port of call is not necessarily international actors that are being deployed. So, being the state should be avoided if at all possible. And I worry that by creating these instruments, that they are basically creating incentive structures for their own deployment that distort the more proper response for international civilian capacity. They need to enable and then get out of the way. The other sort of thing that I want to talk about that's related to this is the need for culturally effective technical assistance. And so this is not, so it's not just northern or capacities, but it's not just southern capacity. So one of the buzzwords right now is sort of the need for greater southern civilian capacity. Well, I would say it's not necessarily, even southern civilian capacity can sometimes not be the most culturally effective mechanism. And so whatever that is, that might be a neighboring state, it might be exiles, but for every context, we need to think about what's culturally effective in terms of technical assistance. And that is not necessarily going to be the former colonial power, but it might be. So the final issue that I want to talk about is transparency. And so I think we need to, I'm a fan of state building. At the same time, I'm uncomfortable with some of the principles articulated in the Paris Declaration. Why is that? Because I feel like they do not acknowledge that while states may be the solution to the problems that we have, states are also the problem in most of these societies. And as long as the states are the problem, then international donors and actors need to take that into consideration in their strategizing. And one area in which, and so if we're going to basically, as I've just articulated earlier, have a heavy sort of international, a light international approach, which doesn't emphasize introducing international capacities, but really emphasizes support for national processes, for national institutions, which essentially is the logic of state building, I think we also, with the other hand, have to ensure that that support is not unqualified and unconditional on behalf of the populations where states are not necessarily representative of those populations. And I think transparency is one area in which we need to basically lean much heavier on these governments in order to ensure that they are responding to their populations. When I was in Haiti last year doing this research, some of the UN officials asked me if I, was meeting with we were talking about budget expenditure categories, and they said, when you're talking to the Haitian government officials, if you can ask them, if you would, to get a hold of some of the categories of expenditures by ministry, because we don't have that. And this is just inexcusable that basically UN officials don't have access to basic categories of expenditures by the national government. And one of the reasons that it's inexcusable is because it means the population doesn't have access to those categories of expenditures. And I think that, this is a crucial area in which international actors can basically use leverage in ways that are widely supported and accepted by the populations of these countries. I think we also need greater accountability related to that. I think transparency, of course, is the first step toward accountability. So more openness, creation of institutional mechanisms of oversight and checks should be part of all of our strategies towards state building, et cetera. So, and I will just close on that note. I have a couple other things to say, but I'll close there and hand it over to Sarah.